There are so many different directions from which you can look at this story and get something very different. In fact, before church today, we were conversing in the back about how could she possibly have been that calm when she found Jesus in the temple. Of course, the Bible doesn't necessarily say that she was calm, does it? Now, perhaps you remember a time as a parent when you turned around and your small child was not right next to you in the grocery store. Then you know the anxiety that Mary and Joseph felt for 3 days. Or perhaps you were that child and you turned around and your mother wasn't there, and what might have been 5 minutes but felt like an eternity was spent trying to find mom or dad. So we can understand the anxiety that might have been present in this situation. Jesus didn't have that anxiety, though. He hung out in the temple. Well, we don't know that. Maybe he did for the first 2 days. Maybe he only got to the temple on the third day. We don't know that. We just know that where Jesus ended up was in the temple with the teachers of the law, the teachers of religion, the religious professionals, the pastoral staff of the church, sitting there and having conversation with them. Now, I want to go back to Mary and Joseph for just a second, because this is the one thing that always struck me. They're really, I remember I grew up Catholic, and in the Catholic Church we had a somewhat, and they still have a somewhat idealized version of this holy family of Joseph, Mary, and Jesus. And somehow they skip town and don't even notice their child is not in the caravan for a whole day. Isn't it nice to know? Think about the ways that you've messed up as a parent if you're a parent. Isn't it nice to know you're in good company? Now, in fact, I want to let them off the hook because the whole family was traveling together, and it's very likely that it might have been somebody else's responsibility with everything that was going on. Somebody else was looking after Jesus. So let's just give them just a break there. But at least they did turn around, they went back, and they searched the city, and they finally find Jesus in the temple, having this remarkable experience with the religious professionals of the day. Now, there's a few things you really want to notice about this, but first, I want to think about this whole idea of what's happening with Jesus and these religious professionals. Perhaps you've noticed or you've witnessed, as I have, a situation where a person, let's not use the word older, but let's use the word grandparent, where a grandparent has a new smartphone and is being instructed on how it works by someone who's 11 years old. It happens. Now, I want to say I've had a lot of experiences with people across the spectrum with regard to how these things work, and I will tell you there are just about as many younger folks who don't understand technology as older folks, okay? So let's just dispel that myth right now. There's plenty of folks I have met in their 20s or 30s, and I don't know how to use this thing. You're going to have to help me with this. Whereas I've run into plenty of people who are in their 70s and beyond who's like, oh yeah, I know what I'm doing here. So it's not necessarily a generational thing, but it is a good example of the kind of thing that we often find someone who is younger explaining to someone who is less younger. Right? Another example would be that you probably see pretty often is the smart TV. Or anything regarding technology where someone who young set it up and is explaining to dad or whoever, no, dad, you push this button to make that happen. Or no, you have to do this to make that happen. Unfortunately, very often we have a hard time learning from the people we don't think we want to learn from. Years ago, I read a book. And I'm sorry, I forget the author's name. I remembered it about 30 minutes ago, but I forgot it now. I'm getting older. So anyway, I read a book called Off-Road Disciplines, which was a book sort of geared towards Christian leaders about different ways of doing things that helped you lead better that aren't necessarily the traditional ways of doing things. And one chapter of that book was called Reverse Mentoring. And it's exactly what you think it is. The idea, and it was a very important admonishment for those leading, especially in medium-sized and larger churches and multi-generational churches where you've got everybody from 8 to 80 that's in the congregation, 8 months to 80, 8 days to 80. The idea was you have a lot to learn from whatever generation is emerging among you. You have a lot to learn from them. In fact, that chapter was so popular and got such a reaction that about 2 or 3 years later, he took just that chapter and he made it into a full book because he realized this chapter needs to be a full book. So there's actually a book called Reverse Mentoring that's really interesting with regard to this. It's kind of what's happening here, isn't it? Jesus shows up in the temple, and here he is having a reverse mentoring relationship with the people who are leading there. It's a little fascinating. Now, it's fascinating from a number of perspectives, but I want to point one thing out to you that you might not notice unless you really dig into this passage. Jesus is 12 years old. That is an important number. 12 is super important. 12 is the number of the apostles. Now, Luke especially has a number of times when 12 is really important. 12 tribes of Israel. 12 apostles. And he even records the story after Jesus ascends when there's only 11 apostles and they're like, oh, we can't have this. We have to have 12. We got to fix this. We have to have 12. But there's another very, very significant thing about Jesus being 12 years old here. In that faith, in that culture, you had a ceremony where you were now officially, although you didn't usually practice it, you were officially able to stand up and actually give your opinion in the synagogue on the scriptures or some such. You basically became a quote-unquote adult. And that happens at age 13, not 12. So Jesus is 12. So even if he was 13, he was too young to instruct people that have graduated from seminary with advanced degrees and lots of letters after their name, no doubt. But in this particular case, it's even more to the point because Jesus is not only underage, he's 12. He's not even really kind of a person yet. How does he know? Why should we listen to this guy? Now, a lot of people read this scripture and they assume, well, what's happening here is Jesus, because he is the Son of God, knows everything there is to know and is instructing these people and letting them know what they should believe on certain things. But if you read that more carefully, you'll notice that's actually not what's happening here. Jesus is listening and asking. They are having a conversation. They're very amazed at Jesus, but he's not doing all the teaching here. And remember, Jesus was fully human. Jesus is 12 years old. Jesus is still learning. So Jesus probably sat there listening to these fascinating teachings from these people, but also able to add the perspective of somebody who happens to understand something about God's plan that these people don't yet. And that's why they're so amazed by him. Now, I love this picture of intergenerational learning, and I sometimes am upset that very often in the church we've lost that vision, and we lose it every single time that a generation comes of age and decides that the next generation after them doesn't have really much to teach them. And even worse, when the emerging generation that is coming of age figures we've got it all together and the generation that is before me has nothing to offer. And I'm going to give you a really concrete example, and I may have shared this with you before. I was in a larger church, and we were having discussions about our small group ministries, our small Bible studies and affinity groups and things like that. And we were specifically talking about this thing called an affinity group. Now, an affinity group is basically just a group of people that come together with a common interest. If you've ever been a member of a book club and you all picked a book, let's say it was a history book club, and you picked a history book you were going to read together, that's an affinity group. You know, and in some cases, recovery groups are affinity groups. They have a common language. They have a common experience from which their connection comes, and that binds them together and gives them something to sort of work with. In this particular case, one of the things we were talking about was one of these affinity groups was going to be, for instance, there's a men's group and there's a women's group. Now, there's nothing wrong with women's group and men's groups. But if that's the only kind of group that someone's ever in, should they even wonder why when they come together in their marriages, they feel like they can't understand the opposite sex? Well, it's because every single time that you're with somebody, you're with someone of the same exact gender as you. Maybe if we were actually spending more time together, like in couples groups, for instance, it might make more sense. But the better example is this one. This is the mothers with small children. So what we do is we get a group of 9 moms, and they all have children under the age of 2, and they share their experiences, and they learn from each other. Does anybody see what's wrong with this picture? This is kind of what I said in the meeting. Does anybody see what's wrong with this picture? You've all been parents for 15 minutes. You're not experts. That doesn't make any sense. Now, what happens very often is folks with very young children, especially if they get married young and have children young, they're still not at the age where they realize that their parents are not idiots, right? So maybe when they get to the age where they think their parents are not idiots, they might think differently. But I said, now imagine this, if you will. Let's have a small group of people. Let's say it's a couples group. And let's say there's 2 or 3 couples in their 20s and 2 or 3 in their 40s and 2 or 3 in their 70s or 80s. Let's say that you've got that group of people. Well, guess what? When this kid with a 2-year-old and they can't figure out what's going on and what to do, and they're trying everything the books say and nothing's working, when they bring this up, guess what? There's a parent with an 18-year-old who says, I went through that. I already know what works and I know it's going to turn out okay. Or maybe even a grandparent that says, not only did I see that in my own kid, I saw that in my grandkid. You might actually learn from somebody who had more experience from you. And in terms of the reverse side of that, I always like to say that as we get older, we have a tremendous amount to learn from the people who are younger than us, because emerging generations, and this is more true now than it ever was in the ancient world, emerging generations are different. They're very different. Now, I'm really conversant with technology, and I understand, how to use the technological communication tools of the day very well, but I didn't have them available to me when I was my son's age. I didn't sit surfing the internet. In that day, the internet was something called books, and you went to the library and you looked stuff up. Anybody remember the library? So I have a lot to learn by watching folks and seeing what they're doing. And occasionally, even though I am actually pretty good with my smartphone and stuff, occasionally, my son who just has a bent towards that, he might just be able to say, look, Dad, if you swipe this way and look at what's here. Oh, wow, thank you. Unfortunately, what we end up with in our day-to-day is this idea that whatever we've learned, whatever skills we've gotten, we feel more complete as we get more and more experience and more knowledge under our belt. A conversation I had with someone recently was what I feel like might be the true Christian's approach towards growth. Now, in just a few weeks' time, and I actually have the date marked on the calendar because it's a date in March. In just a few weeks' time, I will mark literally the 40th anniversary of the day when I came to a real living active faith in Jesus. Now, it doesn't happen in like a moment for everybody, but it did for me. This thing happened. It was a conversion. It was a heart-strangely warmed experience, and over 40 years. And I want to tell you, those first few months and maybe those first 2 or 3 years that I was a believer and I was reading the Bible voraciously, I realized I knew a whole lot more about God then than I do now. Yeah, that wasn't a mistake. I was pretty sure of myself. I know what okay, now I understand this, and this. And as time went on, and I got to the point, because I was very young then, when I got to the point where I was more able to learn from other people, when I experienced a few things, maybe some disappointments, I started to look around and I'm not so sure about that one thing I knew. I'm not sure about that one thing I knew. I'm not so sure that that is always true. I'm not so sure that the Bible means that. I'm not, and even number one in my mind, I'm not so sure that I am ever going to completely understand the God of the universe who is so big that he made everything. How could I possibly be foolish enough to think that I'm going to understand God? So I would love to say that the more we know God as we progress, perhaps we'll be wise enough to know the less we understand about what God and who God is. That's wisdom. That's wisdom that younger folks will not always understand. I've encountered a lot of people, Christian believers in my time, some of whom I've managed to see grow over years. And it has always amazed me at so sure about this, and this. So sure about a whole list of things about God, less sure about as time goes on, but not less faith. Because a God who is easy to explain, and a God who is easy to understand, and a God who agrees with all my positions, sounds like somebody I made up. And the real God that is out there and in here is much richer than that. Right? So, I want to think that as Jesus sat there in the temple, and Jesus' experience was different than yours and mine, because as Jesus grew in faith and in stature, Jesus was understanding more about the God that Jesus was. He kind of cheated a little bit on that, okay? So I want to say that Jesus at 33 was right about everything about God, and I will never be that even if I live to be 133. That's why Jesus is who Jesus is. But I would like to think that I'm thinking of those unbelievably lucky people that got to sit with Jesus for I don't know how long, maybe the whole 3 days. Maybe as soon as Jesus figured out, I'm not, mom and dad aren't here, I know what I'll do. I'll go to the one place they'll probably look for me when they get back here. I'll go to the temple. That's what we came here for. They were a very devout family. They did this every year. That's where they'll find me. And went to the temple and ended up talking to somebody, and before you know it, he's talking to a whole group of them. I would love to think that those people had a taste of how significant their experience was. We don't know anything about the people that sat and listened to Jesus and talked with Jesus. But I'd like to think that some of the folks that followed Jesus that didn't get named as his apostles, that were older, that we don't hear about so much, might have been among that group. When Jesus started to preach, they were like, oh, I remember him when he was a kid. He's coming to town. He's going to talk on that mountain. We got to go hear this guy. I'm telling you, he was amazing when he was a kid. I can't even imagine what he's like now. And here's my prayer for us going forward into 2021, during a time when people who feel differently about this and differently about this and that and the other thing all seem to just go like this all the time. Now, sometimes you can't avoid this, but sometimes we can listen and we can ask. The kind of listening and asking that Jesus did in the temple. And listening and asking doesn't necessarily mean when we disagree that I'm going to change my mind or you're going to change your mind, but we might understand each other more. And this world could use a lot more of that kind of understanding. I always feel like that's what kind of Jesus is teaching us here. This is what the Bible's teaching us. Here's these people that knew everything. They all had their PhDs. They were willing to listen and learn from a 12-year-old child. Are you and I willing to listen to people that are outside that circle of people we think we should? Doesn't mean we change our mind, but at least we listen. I pray that as we head into this year, we become a people who listen. Wherever that message is coming from, and the people who follow the one who listened and asked. Had answers, had questions too. May we be those people in this new and frankly, hopefully exciting year of 2021. Everybody agreed and said, amen.